Okay, welcome everyone. I hope you can all hear and see us. Today we have the privilege of having Carlos Boix and Sir Tim Besley talk to us about insights from Carlos's recent book, Democratic Capitalism at the Crossroads, Technological Change in the Future of Politics. Carlos is the Robert Garrett Professor of Politics and Public Affairs in the Department of Politics in the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs at Princeton University. He has published important work in political economy and comparative politics, particularly around the role of institutions in shaping economic growth and inequality. Carlos' work has been especially impactful in my career choice, I'm happy to share. In 2003, when I was considering what fields to move into, economics, political science, sociology, I read Carlos's book, Democracy and Redistribution. And I was at the time and remain deeply impressed by the sweep and importance of its argument, but also its theoretical parsimony and breadth of empirical support. I highly recommend it. This book, in fact, led me to see political science as a discipline compatible with asking big, important questions, such as will be discussed today, the impact of advances in AI on political institutions and equality. I'm just going to, there we go. Following Carlos' talk, Sir Tim Besley will offer some reflections on the theme. Tim is the School Professor of Economics of Political Science and W. Arthur Lewis Professor of Development Economics in the Department of Economics at LSE. He is also a member of the National Infrastructure Commission and was president of the Econometric Society in 2018. Tim has published in top journals in economics, and I'm also happy to see in top journals in political science on topics spanning political violence, state capacity, economic development, and their interactions. Following this, we will have a 30-minute discussion. Please do it at the bottom of the screen. You can see Ask a Question. Please do click on that and articulate your questions and comments, and then also vote up those questions that you most think worth discussing. We may not get to many or any of them, but I will certainly try to look at them and incorporate them into the conversation. Okay, so with that out of the way, it's again our pleasure to have Carlos introduce some of the themes and insights from his book. So now let me change.
Okay, so thank you so much for your inviting me to this and for this very kind presentation, and thank you to Tim for being willing to discuss the book, and of course to all that are attending. I think it's going, to me at least, it's going to be a bit difficult. It's like talking to a dark room, and normally we are used to see what the audience thinks, at least when we give seminars or talks. So I'll try my best. I hope that the future is not like this, and it's going to be like a short shock to all of us, and we can reconvene in a normal way. So I'm going to use some slides, and let me look for them. Oops. And somehow I cannot find them. Just 1 second. Oh, here. Okay. So I hope you all see them. So basically, this is a book that I published last year, and it's basically driven, writing it by a double motivation. The first one is what I think is a long-term intellectual question, which is the compatibility of democracy and capitalism. This is a long-running question that in the 19th century was basically answered in a very pessimistic way, both by the right and the left. So Marx thought democracy and capitalism were incompatible. Having one person, one vote could not be together with the protection of what he called the interests of the bourgeoisie. But it was also answered in a pessimistic way by conservatives and, in fact, by liberals like John Stuart Mill, who made the point that they would only be compatible provided the population was educated at a high level. Then after this period of pessimism, what we see is in the 20th century, at least in the second half of the 20th century, a period of optimism the coining of the term democratic capitalism, the possibility of having representative democracy, markets, regulated markets, but still free markets, and a kind of strong welfare state. And then today, what we see is a moment of questioning of the compatibility of these two things. And so that's where the book comes. And this links this sort of long-term intellectual question with today's politics. That's the second motivation, which I think it's what has driven most of you to come to attend this talk. And the politics of today, at least in the advanced world, is one where we see a lot of mistrust towards politicians, growing abstention, polarization, and the rise of what many call populist parties. So by this process or this ideational change that I'm talking about during the 19th century, 20th century, and today, also coincides or comes parallel to economic change. So what I'm showing here basically is over time for a few countries for which we have some data, the US, Britain, and Japan, the evolution of their level of income inequality measured by the Gini index. And what we see is high levels of inequality in the 19th century, a sharp decline by the middle or the end of the first third of the 20th century, and then approximately around 1970, 1980, a growing inequality in those countries. So 3 periods. And my answer in the book is that, in a way, this is driven by technological change, which then has consequences on the labor market and in politics. This technological change is basically in the, let's say, industrial capitalism produced or generated by a search for more productivity, an increase in efficiency, and leads to a basically process of capital labor substitution that result in what I would call different production models, especially in what regards to what is the kind of labor that is complementary to capital. So in the book, I distinguish and I discuss 3 moments that are not precise, but that they kind of dominate each century. What I call the Manchester model, where basically what we see is a process of mechanization, at least of some industries. The paradigm of them would be the textile industry, with the use of mostly unskilled labor, the decline of demand for artisans, an increasing use of unskilled labor, that then coincides or leads, there is discussion on that in the literature, with declining wages and a more unequal distribution of income. By the beginning of the 20th century or the end of the 19th century, a set of technological changes such as electricity, what is called the use of parts that are interchangeable that can be used in many different industrial processes, and a production system that has a sequential layout lead to the assembly line in Detroit or in the batch production machine, for example, tobacco machines, that basically result in a decline of very unskilled labor and semi-skilled labor becoming complementary. These transformations in the labor market, I claim in the book, are associated with growing wages for everyone, with a distribution of income equalizing, and with the formation of a class that in the British sociological literature was labeled the affluent worker, or having an affluent working class. Then by the 1970s and 80s, a bunch of changes, mostly an increase in computational capacity and a decline in computing costs, leads to a new transformation that I center in Silicon Valley. So everything in the book moves west from Manchester to Detroit, from Detroit to Silicon Valley. That all these changes in computation lead to an automation of basically routine jobs, and in a way also fosters a new globalization, a real globalization that includes a set of countries that were in the periphery of capitalism into the world economy. China, East Asian countries, with important effects on wages in Europe and North America. The complementary labor at this stage is high-skilled labor, and as economists such as David Autor have shown, the hollowing of the labor market, a polarization of the labor market, a decline in what were considered middle-class jobs, good jobs in the past. So a growing inequality. These changes have have an impact on politics. In the 19th century, the incompatibility of democracy and capitalism led to basically very restrictive suffrage regimes. But in the 20th century, what we see is after a period of strife and World War I and II, and the crisis of the 30s, a process of democratic consolidation, what sociologists and political scientists call the end of ideology period, and very centripetal politics with parties competing for the median voter. This has been in a way replaced today by conflictual politics, by polarization, and by what some call a possible real crisis of democracy and democratic backsliding. I'm going to focus on the rest of the talk on basically this political side of the story, which basically occupies the last two chapters of the book. So let me say that when we look at democracy, at least in advanced countries, which are basically where I pay attention to in the book, with some references to developing countries at the end of the book and at the end of this talk. When we look at the politics of democratic countries, what we observe is a process of, as I said before, depolarization. So here I show how left or center-left and center-right parties, on average, were located in terms of their position in ideological scale left-right, using party manifestos, for which we have information available at least since the end or the beginning of the Cold War period. What we see is a process, as I said, of depolarization. So the lines, both of them, converge towards more moderate positions. Both the center-right parties here in blue and the social democratic parties in red, they become very similar or relatively similar on average, of course, in the 1980s, late 1980s. But what is also very interesting about this graph is that after that process of convergence, they remain basically at the stable and close to each other. This comes in contrast with a process of political disaffection at the mass level. So here what I show is the proportion of people that respond, that politicians care about what people like the respondent, like me, think. What we see is a growing or a decline of trust in politicians. The longest series is the US series represented in black, for which we have data going back to the mid-1960s. At that time, about 60% of Americans thought that politicians care about what people like them thought. There was a decline that coincided with the Vietnam War, a slight increase in the 1980s, and then a big fall in the 1980s, with a very short spike related to the Twin Towers attacks at the beginning of the 2000s. Today, only 20% of Americans think that politicians care about what they think. But the same process happens in Germany in blue, in France in red, in Britain already at low levels in the 1970s, now at only 10% of British voters think that politicians care about them, or at least this was for 2014. It's not the same everywhere. So here I show a case where the trend goes just opposite. This is the case of Finland, where trust is at about 40%, so much higher than any of the big countries. There are other small countries like the Netherlands that have similar levels of trust, or at least in 2015. This process of political disaffection is correlated or comes with growing abstention. So here I show in green the levels of abstention in the US, excluding the South, which is a different, or was a different thing, and where abstention was extremely high as a result of exclusion of African Americans. In Europe is in black, and what we see is that abstention till the early 1970s was at 15%, so extremely low. At that time, the study of abstention in the scholarly literature was a non-issue, so it's very hard to find anyone that was interested in that topic. But today, abstention in Western Europe stands at about 33%, not that different from the US in the East Coast and in the West. The abstention is concentrated in particular sectors. So here I show 3 countries, Finland, for which we have real data because they have a registration system that allows us to track all individuals, and surveys from France and the United Kingdom. And I show the rate of abstention divided by cohorts, so young, middle, and senior, and then by income quintile, just here the top quintile, the middle quintile, and the bottom quintile. And what we see basically is an extremely high level of abstention among young people, but also among those that are in the low income levels. So certainly groups that have experienced, I think, economic shocks, and that in some economies the young are more excluded from labor markets, somehow turning out much less. When we think about the stability of party platforms I was showing before, and this kind of growing alienation of the population, the question basically brings to us a puzzle. Why is that, given the degree of dissatisfaction that was building up among voters for a long time, European mainstream parties, so center-right, center-left parties, those in favor of the consensus of democratic capitalism, didn't react? In part they did, but they did not as much. And it's surprising because when we look at the support among the electorate, what we see is that starting in the 1970s, the percentage of support for center-right and center-left parties, which was at about 70%, had been like that since the end of World War II, started to decline. Today, they together have the support of about 45% of the electorate. So it's a big decline. It corresponds with the increase in abstention, of course. But the question is, why didn't these parties respond? And I think that there are several explanations to that. It could be that fiscal constraints, such as a growing population of pensioners, globalization, prevented them, constrained mainstream parties from acting more strongly in response to this decline in trust. But I think that part of it was also a question of electoral incentives. When we look at the proportion of votes that mainstream parties got in elections, basically until the crisis of 2007, 2008, their level of support was very stable at around 80%. And it has only been in the last 10, 15 years that as a proportion of voters, they have started to bleed votes. This has led to a changed political landscape. So here, in a sort of very stylized way, I represent how we may want to think about electoral politics during what I would call the Detroit capitalism, or the golden age of capitalism, or if you will, the post-war period. The graph has two dimensions. One is about compensation, so basically taxes from high or from low to high. And then there is a vertical dimension, would be globalism, trade, immigration, from being very much against globalism, so at zero, to being very much in favor of globalization. And then I represent the location of voters. In blue, it would be where more or less the location of middle-class voters, and in red, the location of working-class voters. These curves are not, these circles are not indifference curves. It's just more or less representing where is the bulk of the middle classes and the working classes at that time. And then two parties, right and left, located closer to the, let's say, median voter. Here, clearly, the preferences of voters are only different or heterogeneous along the compensation dimension. Globalization at that time was not that important. Again, I'm talking about advanced democracies. And it was not important because there was globalization in the sense of high integration of advanced countries, but the developing countries were not really competing with industrial workers in advanced countries. This has changed progressively, and there has been a process whereby the middle classes have become more heterogeneous, with some part of it, or of those voters, moving towards embracing even globalization even more, those and some less. And then the working class, affected by all the transformations of automation and globalization, moving towards a position that is protectionist, if you will. Here, what I'm talking about is preferences. So in a way, these preferences have been framed or structured, the narratives have been constructed by politicians themselves. And so in this new world, what we see is the growth of an alternative instead of the old R and left of the past. What we see is the growth of this thing called populism, which is a term that I refuse to use without quote marks, because it's a difficult term to define. And I would rather talk about this as anti-globalization or nationalist movements. And so in response to this movement that insists on the second dimension, the trade and immigration dimension, then the response, I think, at least from the left, to get many of its voters back seems to be in a more polarized position. So that would be a movement from L to L prime. So here we would have, if we think about the US, Trump versus Sanders or something like that. So that's how these economic transformations have transformed the politics of the advanced world. And when we look at some data on vote for populist parties, what we see is, again, I show the proportion of people voting for populist parties in the mid-2000s divided by income quintiles. So basically, in the bottom quintiles, the proportion of voters voting for populist parties more than doubles, sometimes triples the vote for populist parties among those at the top income quintile. Of course, this is mediated by electoral institutions in proportional representation systems, populist parties have been had a much easier life in terms of getting the vote and becoming a viable party that is voted by the electorate. In countries like the UK, with a majoritarian system or single past the post system, parties like the UKIP didn't do well in elections, but of course everything exploded in the around the question of Brexit and referendum. So let me now kind of finish by thinking a bit about, or talking a bit about what's next, which is kind of the discussion that is all over the place. And here what we find is a division between techno-optimists and what we want to call techno-pessimists. This is not a new discussion. We go back to the 19th century or the 20th century, and we have the two positions there. So Keynes, as well known from his well-known essay, Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren, has a optimistic position about the effects of technology, and basically considers that with 3 hours a day, we probably will have enough, and we will be able to do many other things, such as what Marx thought communism would bring. So, hunting in the morning and fishing in the afternoon, or the other way around. We also have a pessimistic Marx, at least for capitalism, who thought that at the end of the day, technological change would lead to monopolistic capital, to the immiseration of the working class, and to columns of workers going down into Manhattan and Silicon Valley, I suppose, to burn everything. So what is my position? Well, really, I think we do not know the future, right? So here I'm showing a graph that I find, I don't know if funny, but at least entertaining and in a way revealing. This is data from a paper by two authors, Armstrong and Sotala, that look at papers and books with predictions about when artificial intelligence may replace human activity. And so what I plot here is, I use their plot, in fact, is when did they predict in the horizontal axis that AI would replace human activity, in the sense of when did they publish the paper, and then in the vertical axis, what was the year they predicted AI would replace human activity. And what we see is predictions all over the place that go from, for the latest, from 2020, so papers published in 2010 thought that we would already be replaced, to some that put the date at the end of this century. In fact, there are some authors, like the father of the singularity movement, Kurzweiler, who have made predictions for different years over the over time. So if we do not know what may happen, the only thing I think we can do is to consider different scenarios as they are defined by parameters. That's what I do at the end of the book. I consider 4 things that I think will determine where are we going to go. Some of them are, or 3 of them are mostly economic, if you will, and 1 is political. Those parameters are labor demand, the supply of labor, how concentrated capital may be, and then the responses, the political responses to all this, in the North, but also in the South. So I'll just spend my last minutes on political responses by saying that my assumption through the discussion is that what has changed from the 19th century, so if you remember the first graph I showed, was about the evolution of inequality from high to then declining, and now again growing. What differs today is that in the 19th century, even the most advanced countries, the industrial countries, were poor in comparison with what we are now, right? So a country like the US had a per capita income in 1870 at around $2,500, in 1990 constant dollars. Today, the per capita income is about 30,000. So this change, in a way, has to have an important impact in terms of the room of maneuver that we have to do many things that we could not have done 2 centuries ago or 150 years ago. So which may be the impact of this technological change? As I said at the beginning, there has been a lot of talk about the crisis of democracy, about democratic backsliding. And so when we look at the data, what we find is that in terms of the number of democratic breakdowns since 1800 till now, there were no democratic breakdowns basically in the 19th century because there were no democracies. Then we see a lot of democratic breakdowns in the 1920s and 30s. And then again during the 20th century. But when we look at us today, and given that there are many more democracies, what we see is at least till the year 2015, which is the last year for which I have reliable data, democratic breakdowns have not gone up. So that's, a optimistic thing or information or piece of information we have. What about the probability of democratic breakdowns? Here, what I show is what is the probability that any democracy today breaks down for different levels of income. From the horizontal axis is in thousands of dollars, so 5,000, 10,000, 15,000, and 20,000. And the probability of democratic breakdown here is calculated as the number of democratic breakdowns over democracies for different levels of income from all the data we have in the last 200 years. And for poor countries, the probability of democratic breakdown at any given year is about 6%. For very rich countries, it's about basically 0%. So in principle, the question is, why is that when we look at economic development, more developed countries are more likely to be democratic, or at least for those that are democratic, not to break down? And so there are many different explanations that have been given. It could be that economic development leads to as a result of declining marginal utility of income, makes the rich indifferent about the redistributional mechanisms that come with democratic voting. It could be that economic development is correlated with a set of ideational commitments, such as toleration and so on, that then lead to a more willingness to have democracy. And that's the explanation that I think I prefer, which is that, without excluding the others, but I think it's more important, is that development has led to a different incentive, a different structure of the economy, has led to, at least till now, more equality that then has reduced the social conflict, and has allowed democracy to flourish. So basically, this argument, in some way, to be very quick, runs like this. In the old times, before industrialization, most countries were governed by monarchy and nobility, what Olson would refer as stationary bandits. And as a result of the way they governed, the distribution of wealth was unequal, and in that context, democracy was impossible. Those elites would blocked the introduction of representational mechanisms. Then, with industrialization, a new system appears, what we may want to call open economies, with free markets and with technologies that equalized growth. So 20th century capitalism. When we look at the distribution of cases in terms of Gini's, these are country years. For those cases we have information. with the vertical axis being the Gini index and the horizontal axis being income. In the 20th century, what we see is a mass of countries that among poor countries, there is a lot of heterogeneity in terms of levels of inequality, but for high levels of development, what we see is much lower levels on average of inequality. That is the story, I think, of the 19th century and especially the 20th century capitalism. And so, of course, the question is, what is, I think, in the back of all minds is, what if these open economies, so industrial capitalism, as we know it, free markets, generate increasingly unequal economies? What are the chances of democracy in this context of, yes, much higher levels of prosperity, but also much more inequality? Now, I think that it's difficult to know what will happen. May well be that this inequality may lead to elite capture and to democratic backsliding, and so to mass resentment. So it will basically undermine the foundations of democracy. On the other hand, and I here want to be optimistic, or at least sound optimistic, is that provided that the allocation of returns is thought to be fair, so markets function in a way that do not give advantage to those that have more, and given our already high income levels, it may result this in democratic stability. What do I mean by that? Well, we know that in lab settings, participants generally allocate resources in equal shares, but we also know that they distribute them unequally when in these lab settings, people engage in tasks that require effort. We also know from observational data from surveys that inequality to people is unacceptable high levels, but some inequality is acceptable. So if we maintain a system that is fair, then democracy, even if there is inequality, may well survive. And I think that in the past, democracy was impossible, meaning before the 19th century or before the 20th century, because besides most of the population being poor, the distribution of assets was extremely unfair. The second part of it is that because we have high incomes, this should allow us to develop institutions to respond to shocks, to compensate losers, to make sure that people are helped to adjust to these new technologies. Now, for this to happen, for this democracy to be of quality and to not disappear, we need institutional reforms, in my opinion, to prevent an excessive concentration of economic and political power, to avoid crony capitalism. Here, I think that some democratic accountability mechanisms, such as, of course, finance reform in the US, but also the introduction of ideas such as the electoral voucher, should help. I think that breaking up large companies, I don't want to get into the Zuckerberg-Musk dispute, but I think that making sure that those that have become very advantaged or benefited from these technological changes need to be regulated and perhaps divided into several companies. That also should help. A third thing that I think is not that discussed is that electoral participation matters. That the fact that a lot of people are not turning out, and that these abstainers basically come from low-income young people, this changes the median voter and changes the median representative and has an impact on policy. So changes in participation are fundamental. Mobilization may be fundamental to reverse things that are not good for democracy. And finally, a fourth thing, which is country size. I think that small countries, for some reason, because of the tight relationship between representatives and voters, are better positioned to respond to the excessive concentration of economic and political power of the capitalism of today. This is something that I just suggest. It's not that I'm completely sure, but I think it's something that should be investigated a bit more by all of us. So let me finish by saying that in the book, what I challenge is the standard story. We have a standard story that says that modernization led to the end of history, and instead of what I suggest is that we should think about capitalism as having different technologies with different effects on employment, on wages, and so these may explain the kinds of political honeymoons and political moments of conflict that we have seen in the last 200 years. So thank you so much. I think I stopped sharing, right?
Yes, yeah, your screen's gone. Okay. Let's see if we can get Tim back here as well. So I have a lot of thoughts and questions, but it is our privilege to have Tim go first. Great, we have Tim, your slides are there. Okay.
Okay, is that all good? I can start?
Yes,
so
please.
Let me say what a privilege it is what a privilege it is to have this opportunity to discuss Carlos' work. I'm going to try and add value in a couple of ways. I'm going to raise some issues that I think are important and certainly haven't been exaggerated. Haven't been covered in Carlos's presentation so far. And I'm going to particularly raise an issue around some of the causes of our current discontent. At some level, whenever I think about the topics in this book, one has to be reminded that that there have always been points in history when influential commentators, have told us that the world is on the brink of irrevocable change, and sometimes they've been right. One is reminded of Francis Fukuyama's book On the End of History, which Carlos referred to at the end there. But of course, in an early era, Marx and his followers precipitated some kind of revolutionary change, which really in the end looks like a bit of a blip in human history rather than a fundamental change of direction. In general, such accounts are prone to exaggeration. It's true that in every era there are major sources of disruption, only some of which, of course, are technological, and all at the time seem salient and puzzling. Of course, we're living through the coronavirus epidemic at the minute, which is in its own way creating disruption. Most of such changes have gainers and losers, and those who lose typically fight hard to preserve the status quo. It's important in all of this to realize, and it's not always a point made clearly, that technology is not necessarily an exogenous force. Indeed, almost never is it an exogenous force. Almost all technology changes can be traced to particular things that have happened in history and reflect themselves the societies and the incentives that people had within those societies. So improvements in steam technology in the Industrial Revolution had very clear origins in the economic incentives at the time. Developments in computing were significantly a product of space exploration. Currently, transformations in green technology are responding to the incentives in policy. Robots really are not a force that comes out of the blue. They're a response to the desire to reduce labor costs. And currently, finding a vaccine for COVID-19 is a case in point. And when we think about technology, the uses to which technology is put are even more socially, politically, and economically determined. So at the moment, using Zoom to facilitate working from home is a very salient example. But if you look at, say, the cultural industries, the way live performance has become prized over digital faithfulness, and we've seen a resurgence of vinyl. And these are all to do with the kinds of social, cultural, and political trends that we face. We're currently told we live in an age of anxiety, and to reinforce that, we create what I call a golden age myth. And of course, it's hard not to exaggerate that we are in the midst of anxiety when we're living through a pandemic. And at most points in history, good news stories are not easy to sell. But for those who live in Western democracies, and most of my comments are going to be confined to Western democracies, but we could talk in discussion about other parts of the world. We live in the most peaceful, prosperous, and liberal times probably in human history. And although the gains from this are unequally shared, we also need to remember that this is not zero sum, so that we have all benefited to some extent from these changes. And when we think of when we try and create what I'll call a sense of anxiety deliberately manufactured to make us feel that we are not living in the best of possible times, what we tend to do is to cherry pick from the best bits of the past and make sure we live with selective amnesia. But I do want to talk about the era, the golden era that we often refer to and that we think might be about to fall apart. And I refer to this as the post-World War II social contract, which was built on three pillars: broad-based public provision of goods by the state, social security, health, education; progressive taxation, so that those who have higher incomes generally pay a higher proportion of their income to support that; and personal freedoms and protection of individual property rights to underpin the provisioning of the state with a strong market economy. Now, that post-World War II social contract came from itself a good deal of dislocation in the past. The interwar disruption created by the rise of the Nazi state in Germany that, of course, precipitated the Second World War, the Great Depression, the World War II experience and its narratives of common sacrifice, the communist threat during the period of the immediate post-war period up through 1990, and the spread of participatory and liberal democracy. And this created what I would call a broad consensus on a certain kind of social democratic model. Now, you can say the US lived a little bit outside of that model, but it's certainly been the dominant model in Western capitalism for around 70 years. So we believe, and this is where I come back to the sort of anxiety narrative, that model is under stress, and that's a lot of what Carlos was talking about in his presentation. Here's a particular chart from a paper called The Rise and Fall of Social Democracy by three political scientists, including my colleague Simon Hicks, that there has been in recent years a precipitous decline in votes for social democratic parties, and that continued in spite of the financial crisis. So I think when people became most surprised about that was when, following what was then regarded as one of the largest negative economic shocks of many people's lifetimes, it didn't lead to a resurgence in social democracy. If anything, it led to its even stronger decline. And the question is, why? What's going on? It's not easily explicable in terms of what I would call existing approaches, focusing on things like economic insecurity due to technology and globalization, and I'll come to that in a minute. And I think Carlos is right when he invites us to think about dimensions of politics that are not easily captured on traditional left-right scales. Where I would urge a bit of caution is pinning this on rising inequality. Here's a couple of charts from the UK that I often use to illustrate this, of course, very specifically in a UK context. What it shows you is the Gini coefficient, the standard measure of inequality that we use, running from 1961 to 2016 or 2017, in fact, I think. And what you see is that the biggest rise in inequality by far occurred during the 1980s. And the inequality has been largely flat over the period of the 1990s to the present. And while it's true that the increase in the top 1% share progressed over a longer period, the same story in the last 20 years or so, there hasn't actually been much of an increase in inequality in the UK. And the UK is not unusual. The US does follow what has become the stereotype that everybody refers to, but a lot of European countries have simply not, and the UK is included among that, experienced anything like a precipitous increase in inequality, at least over recent years, exactly the period in which we're invited to think about these rising anxieties about democratic capitalism. It's very unlikely, at least prima facie, that those are driven by inequality unless there is some huge lag in the system, which means inequalities that largely occurred around 20 years ago are now coming home to roost. So what are the causes for social democracy being under stress? I'll quickly talk about those and then I'll wrap up. Technology is clearly one that people refer to, but I think the key element of technology is that we've seen a huge amount of skill-biased technological change, meaning that those who are educated in society have been the greatest beneficiaries of technological change. Second of all, there's globalization. And we talk a lot about in economics about the China shock, the fact that China came into the world economy, albeit back in the 1980s and through the 1990s, and that this caused a certain amount of economic dislocation. But it also seems to be highly correlated with those areas in Europe, and we're seeing this increasingly, where there's been a flight towards right-wing populist parties. During the same period, I don't think we can neglect the fact that there have been a range of cultural trends, particularly the march of liberal attitudes. And as Inglehart and Norris have reminded us, this has precipitated a cultural backlash, which again is linked to the rise of what we now tend to call right-wing populism. I think the thing that, this sort of add something that I didn't see Carlos emphasizing, is that I think education has become an important source of polarization. The college premium has solidified, meaning there's a bigger divergence between people who are educated to college level and those who haven't. And that's not just economic divergence. The difference in social and cultural attitudes between high and low education groups has been an increasing source of polarization. And this is all wrapped up in what I'll call the dystopian view of meritocracy. Meritocracy, of course, was by some revered as a way of running a society on a more fair and open basis. But if we actually go back to Michael Young, who coined the term meritocracy, he viewed it in entirely dystopian terms as a view of the future in which there would be disconnect between those who felt they got on in society because of their own merits and those that were left behind. And for me, social democracy now seems like a kind of elite ideology. It's something that's prized by the educated, cosmopolitan and liberal elites, and has lost its connection to its initial values, which were about social provisioning and trying to provide societies that supported people from disadvantaged backgrounds. And I think that's where identity politics has stepped into the void. It speaks better to many of the anxieties of people, particularly cultural anxieties of people who have not altogether bought in to the move towards more liberal attitudes in society. Now, it's going to be shocking for you to hear from an economist that I don't think this is all about economics. Values matter a lot. People care. What do people really care about? When you start to unpack, they care about reciprocity. They care about people doing their bit and receiving in return for doing things. They care about fairness. They care about their own sense of identity. You only have to look at the British Brexit referendum to be reminded that the main powerful narrative that won that referendum was take back control. And the problem was that economists responded to that narrative by telling people they would be poorer with Brexit, and that really didn't wash. Now, technology matters in this story, but not just because of how it affects productivity and the distribution of rewards. It affects people's sense of empowerment, it affects social interactions, and it affects people's sense of motivation. And I want to come to what I think is the real error in a lot of thinking about this now. That redistribution and compensation is not a fix for these problems. We in economics often use the term compensating losers. The worst thing is being called a loser and therefore being the recipient of compensation. And if we try and say, oh, we're going to deal with problems of dislocation, say due to technology, by compensating losers, I think we're putting ourselves in a very dangerous place. So what is it, on a more positive note, that I think we need to do to reinvent politics? And this isn't a view that just I have. There are a number of contributions now, including, for example, Paul Collier's book on the future of capitalism of a year or more ago. That's really reinstilling a sense of community and thinking about what it is that creates community. For most of human history, it's local, personalized interactions that have shaped our lives. And identity has been shaped around that by creating in-group and out-group relations to reinforce those personal interactions. And we tend to compare ourselves to rather a narrow group of peers. Now, technology can play a positive role in that, but sometimes it's a substitute for personal interaction. Other times, it actually supports certain kinds of personal interaction. Can it help to establish communities with greater mutual understanding, or will it simply enhance polarization? And I think some of our recent experience with social media has really revealed just how much it can be a force for harm, creating narratives of polarization as much as it's created positive benefits. So norms and policies really matter in this context, and we're still in the infancy of trying to explore just how we can create norms and policies that respond to changes, fundamental changes in the way people are communicating in society. And I think that's the big challenge that we have to turn our minds to. If we're going to accept that we can create strong bonds of community among citizens while still getting the benefits of the very real changes that society is experiencing. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Tim. We're just going to adjust the screens now. So we're now going to do a bit of an experiment, or rather, I'm going to tack on a question on top of that, and then we'll hand it back to Carlos to reflect and respond. And then after that, we're going to try to invite to the conversation some of the questions that were asked, the people via video and audio. It may not work, but we'll see what we can do. So on top of Tim's many reflections and thoughts for you, I have one more. So in Carlos's book, you talk about what are the responses to this challenge from automation of greater that could produce greater inequality. And the first one you lay out is education and training, building human capital so that more people have the skills that complement advances in AI and automation. And that's the sort of most, I guess, optimistic solution, because then, people are still working. There's not, you're not engaging in redistribution. You're engaging in productive training. If that doesn't work, you then laid out three other possibilities. One was universal basic income, or some other kind of direct transfer of wealth to those who are at the bottom of the income distribution. A second one was public employment. So employment that's subsidized or fully paid for by the state. And then the third was the socialization of capital. And my question for you is that all of those depend on the ability to tax the wealth produced by capital. But as we know from your 2003 book, capital is to various extent mobile. And so if you try to tax capital, especially if you try to tax it too much, then capital will evaporate or flee from your tax jurisdictions and go elsewhere. So my question for you is, to what extent does capital mobility pose a constraint on our ability to respond at the national level to these challenges from automation?
Okay, so should I answer?
Yes, please, and reflect on Tim's.
Yeah, sure. Okay. So yeah, thank you for this. Well, first of all, thank you, Tim, for a rich discussion. I love these conversations where the roles switch, and so you have the economist talking about endogeneity of technology and the importance of values, and the non-economist responding by saying that technologies in some way are exogenous and insisting on the material part of things. And it's very it's nice to have this type of conversation. So let me say that I basically agree with your points. I will push a bit more in favor of exogeneity of technology as framed in the book. In the book, certainly technology change is endogenous to a set of institutions that made possible for innovators to innovate and then implement those innovations in some way. So property rights, competition, basically having a system which I think is almost like a mystery. Why is that those that win, the winners, do not block change? And this has been I think, the standard story for most of human life. And it's strange that, well, not strange, but interesting, at least almost statistically, that for the last 200 years or 150 years, we have had so many technological change, so much technological change. And it goes against the old regime, the closed society world, in the words of Douglas North, in the terms of Douglas North. So within that structure, I think that there is this struggle to become more efficient, more productive. So within that system, all these technological changes seem to have been, happening at a relentless pace. Now, it is true that I think values matter, but I think that the material or the electoral considerations are very economic around it. And one of the things that I want to just add to what you were saying about social democracy, which is that indeed the problem with social democracy, and by the way, the decline, since, I'm using in the book the data that Simon Hicks kindly shared with me and that you showed. And when you look at the center right and the center left, both decline. So it's not just a crisis of social democracy, it's also a crisis of Christian democracy and, let's say, wet conservatism. For those that are British, this will make sense. But the problem with social democracy is that because this technological change destroyed the basis of social democracy, right? These were parties that relied on the support of the industrial working class. And this industrial working class was progressively eroded by these new technologies. So relying on them alone was not possible to win elections. So they had to add other groups. And this led to a tension in policy that finally led, I think, to the populist explosion. So many that felt abandoned, and perhaps they are not the majority, they moved to a different solution. So I just want to add to what you were saying. Let me go into the question of, this is a great question on globalization and to what extent it may constrain the solutions. So first thing I want to say is that I think that what was interesting about the 20th century system, and I don't want to in any way make it to look at it as a wonderful period. Many things, they were black and white, and we have many more things and more possibilities than before. But what was interesting about that was the complementarity between not just labor and certain types of labor and capital, but also between governmental policies and labor and capital. So most of the things that were provided publicly, health and education, were also very helpful to the production process. And so capital and workers in big plants all benefited from this system. And even though taxes were high, capital didn't flee because the type of labor they had was very productive, healthy, productive, let's say happy. So it was, again, I don't want to mythify, but it was a win-win thing. And so what worries me about today is to what extent there may be a kind of a break or a split between the interests of capital, the owners of fully automatized production processes, and the provision of public goods. That would be a terrible thing to happen, right? So I think that globalization constrains capital, but it only constrains capital when you can find labor that is as cheap cheaper than yours. But of course, your labor in your home country, how productive that is, depends on sometimes paying taxes and the provision of public goods. And this may disappear. They may snap this relationship. Now, to be optimistic, though, for those that may be very pessimistic when I say that, is that, but it's a so it may be pessimistic for those that are in developing countries, is that if automatization keeps growing, it may well be that we have a lot of reshoring, right? Because there is no reason why you should have automatized plants in China if you can produce everything next to your distribution or consumption or your customers, right? So capital may have an incentive to leave, but on the other hand, for the reasons, because they don't need this kind of labor that they needed in the past, and now with only investing in college-educated workers, they can be very productive. On the other hand, perhaps production will come back to the places it was 50 years ago. But I think in some way it's a speculation, and I don't want to go too much into that.
Thanks so much. And I recommend to the audience to look at the last chapter of Carlos's book for more productive speculation on this topic. So we're now going to turn it over to Anton Kornek, who's a co-organizer of the webinar. And we also have several other people who ask questions queued up. So we'll see if we can do this efficiently.
Hello, thank you so much for the insightful presentation and discussion. You emphasized the differential impact of technology on low, medium, and high-skilled jobs. Now, in the recent past, technology has indeed substituted for the low-skilled and complemented the high-skilled. But should we be concerned about AI going more and more for the high-skilled tasks and jobs, like say law, radiology, and so on would be examples? And how would that affect your predictions for the future?
Can you repeat the last two sentences? That it may affect what types of? I didn't.
More and more of the high-skilled jobs,
okay,
as opposed to low-skilled. And how would that affect your predictions for the future?
Do you want to collect more questions, or should I answer each one?
Let's see if we can collect the questions. So thank you, Anton. So now we'll see if we can move over to Bao. This service has a maximum of 4 people on screen. And if we drop any of us, it is hard to add us back in. So that's why we have the one at a time feature. Okay, maybe if Bao shows up, then she can ask her question. But until then, Carlos, maybe you can start reflecting.
Yeah, absolutely. So, well, I think that basically, if that's a question that we are not sure about exactly whether it's going to happen and when it's going to happen, but certainly let me say that if these high skilled jobs are affected, what may end up happening. So let me put it in a slightly different way from a political point of view. What we are seeing so far has been a disruption in wages and in jobs and wages for certain parts of the population. Again, these disruptions are a part of capitalism, right? But it looks like we have a big disruption going on. And the question here is, to what extent can we adjust to this disruption? Either because people move on their own to new jobs and get their skills to basically to other things, or because the public institutions step in and help in this process of adjustment. So one of the things I discuss at the end is that so far we have been very successful in this adjustment process. When we look at 200 years, we have had, so the story is a complicated story with lots of crises, but at least during the 20th century, we have been able to create fairly just, if you will, societies, at least in the provision of education and public. I mean, there are many things that have to change, but that there has been substantial progress. Now, the question, I think, in Anton's, the issue in Anton's question is basically what happens if more and more higher skilled jobs are affected by these technologies. So it could well be that this, in a way, reinforces the incentives of politicians to respond to this crisis, right? Because one of the things that can happen is that if somehow these technologies only disrupt lower skilled jobs, it may well be that this is just a minority, a substantial, a fairly big minority, but it's still a minority of society. They may vote for populist parties, but may never be the majority. And so the majority may not be interested in the life chances or in the possibilities of those that are, the losers of this. Now, to the extent that these new technologies change, this may even create a bigger majority that forces responses from the government. So let me, think about this politically and say it may well be that if the speed of transformation is very, very quick, very fast, then politically it may lead to the construction of a majority that asks for policy responses more forcefully.
Thanks. So just before we turn over to Bao, we're at time right now. So for those of you who have to leave, thanks for joining us. It looks like we'll run over by a few minutes. We have 2 more questions queued up. I also want to especially thank Tim for joining us, sharing his thoughts and engaging in this conversation, as I know Tim has to leave fairly soon. So thank you, Tim. Okay, go ahead, Bao, please. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I have a question. So the late Alberto Alesina, unfortunately, he just passed away recently. He had argued that the U.S. was unable to expand its welfare state because its population is racially heterogeneous. A lot of white voters don't want to necessarily expand the welfare state because they don't want Black citizens to be able to benefit from these programs. As the US and some parts of the EU become more racially diverse through immigration and ethnic minorities demand more rights, we have observed this nativist backlash. And I just wonder, will this anti-immigration tied in with anti-globalization sentiment continue to prevent states from addressing the inequality that's produced by technological change? And I am particularly worried given that climate change will probably cause a lot of forced migration. This will continue to be an issue that exacerbates as time goes on. Thank you.
Thank you. This is a great question and a difficult question to answer because I think it's pretty complex. It all requires a very complex discussion, but let me try my best. I think that one of the things that I think we should worry about, besides this question, this purely electoral question, which is, I think, fundamental, is the following one, is that in the past, as I see it, the labor market was one that had a very strong middle, and a lot of people that kind of climb up the ladder from unskilled into semi-skilled jobs and then skilled jobs. So the labor markets of the 50s, the 70s, the 60s were places where the demands in terms of skills were not extremely high, and those that immigrated into these advanced societies, if not them, their children were able to go to climb up the ladder fairly well in many cases, or the integration was not difficult, right? So think about Italians or Spaniards migrating to Germany, to France, also minorities into the UK, some minorities or some groups, at least in Europe. What has, I think, changed is that if we believe the story of the hollowing of the middle, so if we believe the David Autor and others' story, what we see is the kind of disappearance of these jobs in the middle. And so if we combine this with minorities that move in, so if this story is true, what we have now is a society with highly well-paid, high-skilled jobs, and then unskilled jobs that cannot be automatized because they require a set of things that cannot be easily automatized. Then, but we lack this middle. Then in a way, we are segmenting the labor market. And if we interact this with ethnic divisions or racial divisions or divisions by, of origin or so forth, this may reinforce conflict. And that's something that worries me. So I think that that's one of the big issues of the future. And it starts in the labor market. So it's also about elections, but it starts in the labor market.